There is a silence in the room, not the kind that comes from emptiness, but the kind that rises after the noise has been mastered. This silence lives with her, not beside her. Within her, to walk a path without the footsteps of another beside you requires more than strength, it requires clarity. A woman who chooses solitude not from rejection, but from recognition, has begun to see something that many miss. She does not wait to be chosen. She has already chosen herself, and so the world cannot distract her with its offerings. When there is no boyfriend, no partner, no one to lean upon, she leans upon her own spine. And she learns if it will hold. It is in this aloneness that the mirrors begin to crack. Not because they break, but because she stops needing them. No one to impress, no one to charm, no one to adjust for. Only breath, only movement, only the tasks of the day. She cooks not to please, but to nourish. She walks not to be seen, but to return. She sleeps not to dream of someone, but to rest with herself. And when the nights stretch long, and the shadows press upon the window, there is no warm hand reaching across, only the rhythm of her own heart, and the echo of her own name, spoken not by a lover, but by the silence itself. To live alone is not a punishment, it is a temple, a dojo, a place where the unnecessary is shed, and what remains is the woman herself, undivided, unwatched, unshaped by hands that would mold her. She is not waiting. She is not lacking, she is not searching, she is. Solitude is often mistaken for deficiency. A woman without a partner, a boyfriend, a companion. Some assume she must be waiting, or worse, she must have been left. They frame her as missing something vital, as if without the presence of another, particularly a man, she cannot be whole. But this assumption is a reflection of cultural conditioning, not of reality. Solitude is not lack, it is space, it is quiet, and in that quiet, strength begins to emerge. Not the kind that needs to be proven or displayed, but the kind that rests deeply inside the bones and breath of a person who knows they can stand alone. When a woman chooses solitude, or simply finds herself in it without seeking to fill the space with noise, distractions, or relationships, she does something very rare. She meets herself fully. Without the mirroring presence of someone else shaping her self-perception, she begins to listen to her own internal voice. At first, that voice may be quiet, uncertain, or even hidden beneath the many voices she has adopted over time, voices of expectation, of past partners, of family, of society. But with time, space, and silence, those layers peel away, and what remains is her, unfiltered, uncompromised, unaccompanied, not in the sense of being forsaken, but in the sense of being finally, completely with herself. Strength is often thought of as force, willpower, or resistance. But true strength, the kind cultivated in solitude, is more elemental. It is the strength to sit with discomfort rather than flee from it. It is the strength to face one's fears and not mask them behind someone else's presence. It is the strength to find joy in the everyday moments that pass unnoticed when life is cluttered with the needs and expectations of others. It is not the kind of strength that shouts. It is the kind that hums, steady and soft, beneath the surface of everything she does. A woman who lives alone, without the cushion of romantic companionship, does not delegate her emotional needs to another. She must learn how to hold herself through the ebb and flow of her own moods, her anxieties, her uncertainties. There is no boyfriend to offer comfort or distraction. She becomes her own source of calm. She becomes her own guide, her own witness. This doesn't make her hard. It makes her honest. In this solitude, she does not pretend to be okay when she is not, nor does she need to perform resilience for someone else's benefit. She is allowed to be soft. She is allowed to cry. She is allowed to be confused and still feel whole. In the stillness of a life unshared romantically, a woman finds time to refine the details of her existence. She may light candles in the evening, not for ambience for another person, but because she finds beauty in flame. She may eat at the table, slowly and attentively, not waiting for conversation, but listening to her own thoughts as they wander and return. She walks through the world alert, not because she is afraid, but because she is aware. Every street, every cafe, every bookstore becomes her own, not marked by memory with someone else, but etched with the solitude of presence. This strength she cultivates does not grow in opposition to men or relationships. It is not born from bitterness or resistance. It is not a rebellion against love. It is an embrace of reality. She understands that a boyfriend is not a requirement for wholeness. Companionship may come or it may not, but either way, she will not be defined by the presence or absence of someone else's attention. She is already someone fully right now. She is not practicing for a future where she will be loved. She is loving herself in the present moment, not with slogans or superficial self-care, but with attention, depth, and dignity. The world often views women in relationship to others, as daughters, as wives, as mothers, as lovers. But a woman alone escapes those definitions. She exists outside of the roles others want her to play. This can be uncomfortable for those who want to understand her through familiar categories. A woman alone without a boyfriend is not easily labeled. She is not taken or single in the traditional sense. She is not waiting and she is not hiding. She is living, and in that living, she holds the fullness of her own existence in her own hands. Some people fear solitude because they equate it with loneliness. But these are not the same. Loneliness is the ache of disconnection. Solitude is the art of connection with the self, and this art, like all others, requires practice. The first days or weeks or months may be filled with resistance, with the impulse to reach for a phone, for social media, for any voice that is not the one within. But gradually, if she allows it, that internal voice strengthens. And then she begins to see the architecture of her own inner life, what she values, what she fears, what she dreams, what she no longer needs. When there is no boyfriend to affirm her worth, she learns to stop looking outside for affirmation. She turns inward. She discovers her worth in the way she wakes up each morning and chooses to keep going, not for anyone else, but for herself. She finds it in her ability to say no, to set boundaries, to choose rest over performance. She finds it in the way she can look at her reflection and not ask if she is desirable, but ask if she is well. Living alone, she also becomes deeply acquainted with time. There is no one else's schedule to orbit around. She discovers the natural rhythm of her days. She may rise early and write, or stay up late and read. She moves through the hours without apology. There is a freedom in this that cannot be overstated. To live without the expectation of constant communication, without the emotional maintenance of a romantic relationship, is to reclaim energy that can be directed toward growth, creativity, or stillness. This freedom, however, is not without weight. There are moments when she will feel the absence of another. There are evenings when she will wish for a voice, a hand, a warm body beside her. But these moments do not diminish her. They humanize her. They remind her that while she is whole alone, she is not invulnerable. Yet she does not let these desires define her. She acknowledges them, honors them, and continues. She does not rush to fill the space just because it feels empty sometimes. She understands that emptiness too has something to teach. There is also a kind of pride that emerges, not the boastful kind, but the quiet kind. The pride of knowing that she navigates her life by her own compass. That she has created a home where peace resides. That she knows how to fix a leaky faucet, how to soothe herself during sleepless nights, how to handle her finances, how to celebrate her own birthday. That she is not waiting for someone to choose her because she has already chosen this life, not by default but by design, and if someone comes into her life, they will not enter to complete her, they will enter to witness her. To share space, not to occupy it, she will not shrink to make room. She has learned to take up the full expanse of her own existence, and she will not contract again for someone else's comfort. This is the strength solitude gives. It gives a woman back to herself. There are those who will not understand, who will question, who will pity, who will even fear her independence, but she no longer lives for their understanding. She lives for her truth, for the sound of her own laughter in a quiet kitchen, for the peace of knowing she is enough, for the knowledge that she can stand, walk, work, weep and wonder, without needing to hold another hand, and in this knowing, in this solitary strength, she finds something rare. She finds herself, not as others want her to be, not as society scripts her to be, but as she truly is, unnamed, unclaimed, unshaken, complete. There is a kind of self that can only be met in silence. In the stillness of being alone, where no one else's eyes are watching, and no expectations shape your posture, a different kind of truth begins to emerge. When a woman lives without the constant presence of others, especially without romantic partners, what begins to unfold is not loneliness, but revelation. Aloneness is not a void, it is a doorway, and self-discovery is the path that lies beyond it. From childhood, a woman is often shaped by the gaze of others. She learns early how to please, how to adjust, how to make herself likable, safe, soft, pleasing. Her emotions are measured against how they affect those around her. Her dreams are filtered through what is acceptable or admirable. Her identity becomes a reflection in many mirrors. Mirrors held by parents, friends, lovers, teachers, and society. In the presence of a boyfriend or partner, she often learns to mold herself, whether consciously or unconsciously, into what is most compatible. Love becomes something she navigates carefully, often compromising parts of herself to maintain harmony or avoid conflict. But when she is alone, those mirrors fall away, and in their absence, she begins to see herself not as others see her, but as she is. There is a period of adjustment in solitude. In the beginning, the quiet can feel sharp. The absence of distraction forces attention inward. Thoughts once drowned out by conversation or affection rise to the surface. These thoughts can be uncomfortable. They carry the weight of all the roles she has played and the parts of herself she has suppressed. But this discomfort is not a problem to be solved. It is an invitation. In the absence of external validation, she is confronted with the question, who am I when no one is watching? Who am I when I do not need to be useful to anyone else? With time, she begins to explore these questions with sincerity. She wakes up in the morning and chooses what to wear based on how she feels, not how she will be perceived. She begins to notice what brings her real joy, what food she truly craves, what music stirs her, what activities quiet her racing thoughts. She learns that some things she believed she loved were habits formed to connect with others. She learns that some dreams were never really hers. This unlearning is slow and tender. It requires patience, but it is the first step in remembering the self that existed before the world told her who she should be. As she spends more time alone, the layers begin to fall away. She finds herself reading books she wouldn't have chosen before. She sits in silence without reaching for her phone. She discovers her rhythms, how her energy flows through the day, what kind of rest she truly needs when her creativity blooms. She no longer asks for permission to change. She simply changes. There is no one to explain herself to, no one to perform for. And this freedom, while at first unfamiliar, becomes sacred. Without a boyfriend to talk to late at night, she learns to listen to herself. Her inner dialogue grows louder, but also clearer. The voice inside that used to be buried beneath compromise begins to speak with strength. It says, "This is what I believe, this is what I want, this is what I need," and in learning to trust that voice, she begins to trust herself in ways she never has before. Decisions are no longer filtered through the lens of how they will affect a relationship. They are filtered through alignment, through integrity, through truth. In solitude, she also meets her shadows, the parts of herself she has avoided, the parts she thought someone else would fix, the sadness she never processed, the fear she kept beneath her smile, the insecurities that made her doubt her worth. Without distraction, these shadows rise, and instead of running from them, she begins to sit with them. She begins to understand them. And in understanding, she begins to heal. No partner can do this work for her. It is hers alone, and though it is hard, it is holy, because every wound she tends to with her own hands becomes a source of power. Every piece she reclaims becomes a part of her strength. She begins to feel her body in a new way, not as an object to be desired, but as a vessel for experience. She eats not to impress, but to nourish. She moves not to shape, but to feel. She begins to notice the way her body responds to rest, to touch, to nature, to stillness. She listens, and in that listening, she reconnects with herself not as an image, but as a living, breathing being. Time becomes a teacher in her solitude. The days are longer, and they ask more of her. She learns to fill them without relying on someone else's presence. This, too, is self-discovery. She realizes what she reaches for when no one is there. What comforts her, what challenges her, what she is capable of. She begins projects she never thought she could. She learns new skills, she rebuilds, she designs a life not based on convenience, but on choice. Her memories surface differently in solitude. The past becomes a museum she walks through, not a place she lives in. She sees old patterns, how she once silenced herself in arguments, how she feared being too much, how she accepted less than she deserved. These memories do not define her anymore. They teach her, and she listens not with regret, but with resolve. She knows now what she will no longer tolerate, what she will never abandon again, herself. She also begins to notice beauty in smaller things. The way the sun moves through her window in the afternoon, the sound of her footsteps in the hall, the joy of making herself laugh. These moments, unnoticed in the company of others, become precious. They are not grand, but they are real, and in their simplicity she finds peace. She no longer needs the highs of passion or the validation of being chosen to feel alive. She feels alive in her own skin, in her own space, in her own company. In this space of aloneness, she redefines intimacy. It is no longer limited to romance. It becomes the depth of her own attention to her life. It becomes the softness with which she holds herself. It becomes the authenticity with which she engages with others, no longer driven by the need to impress or be accepted. Her relationships shift. Some fall away, some deepen. She becomes more honest, and she expects honesty in return. Because she is no longer afraid of being alone. She knows now that being alone is not empty. It is full. She begins to dream again, but differently. Her dreams are not centered on partnership, but on purpose, on impact, on joy. She asks herself, what am I here to do? What do I want to create? What kind of life do I want to build? And she starts building it, one small, intentional act at a time, without waiting for someone to walk beside her. She walks, and that walk becomes sacred. There are moments, of course, when she feels the absence, when a holiday passes without a shared celebration, when she hears laughter from couples walking hand in hand, when a sudden wave of longing moves through her, but she does not run from these moments. She sits with them, she breathes through them, she reminds herself that her path is not lesser, it is simply different. And it is hers entirely. This path of aloneness is not for the faint of heart. It requires courage, it requires presence, it requires a willingness to face everything within, but it offers something no relationship can guarantee, a complete, unshakable understanding of self. And with that understanding comes a kind of freedom that cannot be taken, because it was never given by anyone else. In solitude, she becomes her own anchor, her own home, her own beginning. She no longer searches for someone to define her. She defines herself again and again in the quiet, in the chaos, in the beauty of a life fully lived, fully felt, and fully owned. There is a quiet transformation that takes place when a woman begins to live for herself and not for others. It is not marked by loud declarations or sweeping gestures. It happens in the small choices, in the subtle shifts of intention, in the unspoken decisions made daily without performance or apology. A woman who lives for herself does not abandon love, family, or community. She simply stops abandoning herself. She stops bending to be palatable. She stops shrinking to fit into someone else's frame. She does not rebel out of anger. She realigns out of clarity. She begins to see that her time, her energy, her presence, and her voice are sacred, not because someone else says they are, but because she finally believes it. From the time she is young, she is taught, often without words, that her value lies in how well she can care for others. She is praised when she is helpful, when she is quiet, when she is agreeable. She learns how to read a room before she even knows how to read a book. She internalizes the art of sensing what others need and giving it before they ask. In many ways, this becomes her superpower. She becomes nurturing, intuitive, adaptable, but beneath these gifts, something deeper starts to ache. She begins to forget what her own needs feel like. She forgets the sound of her own no. She forgets that pleasing others is not the same as loving herself. As she moves through life, this pattern deepens. In relationships, she often gives more than she receives, not because she is weak, but because she is wired to serve. She anticipates needs, she holds space, she softens conflict, she dims her opinions to preserve harmony. At work, she takes on more than her share, often without credit. In friendships, she becomes the reliable one, the listener, the fixer. She wears these roles like armor, and for a time it works. She is admired, she is needed, she is liked. But being liked is not the same as being known, and over time, the gap between how others see her and how she feels inside begins to widen. The turning point is rarely dramatic. It is usually quiet. It is the moment she looks in the mirror and doesn't recognize her own reflection. It is the fatigue that no amount of sleep can erase. It is the silence in a room full of people where she suddenly feels invisible. It is the realization that her life, while full, does not feel like her own, and when that moment comes, something inside her begins to stir. A quiet voice that says, "This isn't working, this isn't me. This is not what I came here to be." Choosing to live for herself does not mean she becomes selfish or cold. It means she begins to center her life around her own truth. She starts asking different questions. Instead of "what will they think?" she asks, "what do I feel?" Instead of "will they be okay with this?" she asks, "am I okay with this?" Instead of "what do they need from me?" she asks, "what do I need from myself?" These shifts are not easy. They are not always welcomed. When a woman who has always been available suddenly sets boundaries, the world around her resists. But she no longer lives to keep others comfortable. She lives to be whole. Her days begin to change. She wakes up and checks in with herself before checking her messages. She says no to invitations that drain her. She stops explaining her choices. She lets silence speak for her where once she would have over-explained. She dresses for how she wants to feel, not how she wants to be seen. She lets go of commitments that no longer align with her. She stops performing strength and allows herself to be soft when she needs rest. She no longer ties her worth to her productivity. She learns to sit in stillness without guilt. Living for herself also means returning to the parts of her she left behind. The hobbies, the art, the dreams, the silliness, the mess, the curiosity. She gives herself permission to be more than one thing, to change, to evolve. She does not ask for permission to take up space. She does not apologize for her presence. She begins to honor her intuition, to listen to her body, to trust her own timing. She realizes that not every opportunity is for her, Not every relationship is meant to last, and not every expectation deserves to be met. She reclaims her power not by dominating others, but by refusing to abandon herself. There are losses along the way. Some relationships fade. Some people do not understand this version of her. They miss the woman who molded herself to meet their needs. They miss her availability, her agreement, her acquiescence. But she does not grieve the loss of roles she was never meant to play. She grieves instead the years she played them. She grieves the times she said yes when she meant no, the times she smiled to keep the peace, the times she kept silent to avoid tension. She feels that grief, and then she lets it move through her, and in its place a new sense of self begins to grow. This self is rooted. She no longer reaches outward for validation. She no longer fears disapproval. She knows that she is not for everyone, and that is no longer a problem. She is for herself. She is her own witness, her own cheerleader, her own sanctuary. She learns to validate her own experience. She learns to soothe her own fears. She learns that solitude is not emptiness but space, space to listen, to breathe, to create, to heal. As she lives for herself, the way she connects with others also changes. Her relationships become more authentic. She no longer performs. She no longer pleases. She speaks her truth even when her voice trembles. She allows others to see her fully, not just the curated version. And in doing so, she invites others to do the same. Her presence becomes a mirror for honesty. She is no longer interested in surface-level connections. She seeks depth, alignment, reciprocity. She knows that love, in its truest form, does not require self-abandonment. This way of living does not mean she never compromises. It means she no longer compromises her core. She learns the difference between bending and breaking, between adjusting and erasing, between giving and losing. She gives from fullness, not depletion. She helps when it feels true, not when it is expected. She stands firm when it matters. She does not need to be understood to stand in her truth. She does not need approval to trust her path. Living for herself also means redefining success. She no longer chases titles or metrics that do not resonate. She defines her own measures of fulfillment. Peace becomes a goal. Joy becomes a compass. Integrity becomes a North Star. She lets go of timelines that were never hers. She allows life to unfold without the need to control or prove. She celebrates her small wins. She honors her growth even when no one else sees it. She understands that progress is not always visible. Sometimes it is simply the way she now treats herself with kindness, the way she no longer betrays herself, the way she now breathes more freely. Her days may still be full of responsibilities, of work, of care, of effort. But they are no longer governed by external demands. They are guided by choice. Even in moments of exhaustion, she knows she is living a life that reflects who she truly is. She no longer wears masks. She no longer hustles for her worth. She knows her worth is inherent, unshakable, and not contingent on being needed by others. This way of life is not always easy, but it is real, and in its realness, it offers a freedom that cannot be found in approval, applause, or attachment. It is the freedom of authenticity, the freedom of alignment, the freedom of being rooted in self, in truth, in presence. She no longer asks, "What do they want from me?" She asks, "What is true for me?" She no longer measures her life by how many people she pleases. She measures it by how often she feels peace when she is alone. She no longer lives to fit into a world that asks her to be small. She lives to expand into the fullness of who she is, and in doing so, she becomes not only more herself, but more alive. Aloneness, when stripped of all its stigma, its pity, its societal suspicion, reveals itself as something else entirely. It reveals itself as a sacred practice. Not as a punishment, not as a deficiency, not as a symptom of rejection or failure, but as a way of being that is rich with insight, with presence, and with return. There is an intimacy to aloneness that no crowd can offer. There is a clarity in its quiet that cannot be found in the noise of togetherness. A woman who embraces aloneness without apology, without fear, without narrative, discovers a world that exists within and around her, a world that does not ask for performance, that does not demand negotiation, that does not seek to define her. In that space, aloneness is not something she survives. It is something she practices, with reverence, with depth, with her full attention. The practice of aloneness begins not in isolation, but in presence. It is not about being away from people as much as it is about being with oneself completely. That means not filling the silence with distractions, not numbing the quiet with screens, conversations, or obligations. It means sitting with the ache when it comes, not to fix it, but to understand it. It means noticing the thoughts that arise when there is no one to echo them. It means allowing discomfort to exist without immediately rushing to soothe it with someone else's company. In that kind of stillness, a woman begins to hear things she's never heard before. She hears herself. There is a pace to aloneness that resists the rush of the world. It is slower, more deliberate. It invites observation rather than reaction. In this pace, she starts to see things she's overlooked. The shape of a tree outside her window, the rhythm of her own breath, the way her body curls into comfort, the subtle cues her emotions give her before she even speaks. Aloneness teaches her to pay attention, not to what others are doing, but to what she is feeling. It's not a withdrawal from life, it's a deeper engagement with it, one that happens beneath the surface of conversation, beneath the demands of social identity. When aloneness is practiced intentionally, it becomes spiritual. It becomes a return to essence. A woman begins to remember who she is when no one else is asking her to be anything else. She meets the version of herself that does not cater, does not adjust, does not shrink, does not explain. She meets the version of herself that is honest even in stillness. She meets her anger without softening it for someone else's comfort. She meets her joy without needing it to be shared to be valid. She meets her grief and lets it breathe without forcing it into something poetic. In this way, aloneness becomes a place of truth, not decoration. There is a sacred discipline to choosing oneself repeatedly in a world that constantly encourages merging, coupling, and defining identity through relationships. A woman who practices aloneness learns to be whole without being paired. She stops measuring her value by how many people want her, need her, call her, praise her. She stops mistaking connection for validation. She learns that being with others is a gift, not a requirement for worth. That her solitude is not something to fix, it is something to feel, and in that feeling she finds a sense of freedom that no partnership can manufacture. Not because she is closing herself off from love, but because she has made space for the deepest love to take root, the love that begins from within. There is power in walking through a grocery store alone and not rushing. There is power in cooking a meal for herself and sitting down to eat it without a screen or a conversation to fill the space. There is power in sleeping across the entire bed, in dancing in her own living room, in singing to herself with no one listening. These acts may seem mundane, but they are ceremonial when done with presence. They are declarations: I am here, I am enough, I do not need an audience to matter, I do not need to be seen to exist. Aloneness also becomes a way to detox from the world. From the expectations, from the projections, from the constant shaping and reshaping of self in relation to others. When a woman steps away from all of that, she begins to notice what is hers and what isn't. She notices which thoughts are inherited, which insecurities are borrowed, which beliefs no longer feel aligned. Without the continual feedback loop of external opinion, she clears the static, and in that clearing, she reconnects with her own voice, her own knowing, her own rhythm. Aloneness does not isolate her, it aligns her. In a culture that glorifies busyness and connection, choosing stillness and solitude is an act of rebellion, but it is also an act of return. It is a return to sovereignty, to integrity, to remembering that she does not belong to anyone but herself, that she is not a role to be filled, that her aloneness is not a space waiting to be interrupted by another person's presence, but a sacred field in which her life can grow freely. She learns to cultivate that field with care, with rituals that nourish, with habits that root her, with silence that heals. This practice also sharpens her discernment. When she no longer fears aloneness, she is no longer tempted to fill it with whatever comes along. She stops settling for half-hearted love. She stops tolerating friendships that drain her. She no longer clings to company that keeps her from feeling lonely, because she has learned the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is the ache of not being seen. Solitude is the relief of not having to be seen to feel real. She chooses quality over quantity. She knows now that her energy is sacred, and she offers it only where it is honored. She becomes her own sanctuary, her own mirror, her own listener. She prays without needing to be heard. She creates without needing to be praised. She rests without needing to be deserved. She becomes so attuned to her own needs that she no longer waits for someone else to anticipate them. She meets them herself, and in doing so, she becomes whole in a way that no external attention could ever replicate. She begins to see that the love she sought so desperately in others was a map, one that led her back to herself. The sacred practice of aloneness does not make her invulnerable. It does not remove the desire for connection. It does not pretend that being seen and held by another is not beautiful. It simply means she no longer loses herself in pursuit of it. She no longer abandons her own company just to avoid discomfort. She knows that being alone is not a lesser state. It is not a waiting room for something better. It is its own rich, fertile ground. It is not something to apologize for. It is not something to explain. It is something to inhabit with reverence. She walks slower now. She breathes deeper. She does not fill space to prove she belongs in it. She belongs because she exists. Her presence does not need a partner to be validated. Her peace is not dependent on being chosen. She chooses herself again and again in the sacred stillness of her own life. And in that choice, she becomes grounded. She becomes clear. She becomes deeply, fiercely alive. Not because someone else sees her, but because she sees herself. And that vision is finally enough.